What if the oldest story we've ever told wasn't the beginning at all? What if it was only the last echo of something far older, beneath the deserts of southern Iraq, where the air hums softly with heat and the sand hides the color of time? Fragments of clay still whisper in forgotten tongues. Each mark pressed into wet earth 5,000 years ago was meant to preserve a truth. Yet now, the truth sleeps beneath layers of ruin and silence, waiting for someone willing to listen. As Americans, we've been taught that civilization began with Greece and Rome, that our heritage traces back through European roots. But what if that timeline is incomplete? What if there's an older story, one that connects us to something far more ancient and profound? The story begins not with discovery, but with dust. In the late 19th century, when American entrepreneurs were building railroads across the continent, British and French archaeologists dug into the plains near modern-day Uruk and Ur. Their spades struck clay that had been hardened by centuries of neglect. Tablets upon tablets, stacked like the fossilized memory of an entire people. They were called the Sumerians. And from the moment their name was spoken aloud again, something unsettling began to stir in our timeline. Because what they left behind wasn't the hesitant scroll of a newborn civilization. It was already complex, measured, and deeply aware of the cosmos. The earliest Sumerian records appear as if from nowhere around 3500 BCE. With no slow evolution leading to them, their language was fully formed, their city plans geometrically aligned, their astronomical charts already precise. They built temples, ziggurats, irrigation systems, and mathematical systems that still form the bones of our calendar today. It was as if the curtain had suddenly lifted on a civilization that began in full bloom, then faded as mysteriously as it had appeared. Scholars have long struggled to explain that suddenness, but perhaps they're asking the wrong questions. Dr. Richard Schoch, the Boston University geologist who dared to challenge orthodox dating of ancient monuments, puts it bluntly from his office overlooking the Charles River. The evidence suggests we're looking at inheritance, not invention. When you strip away academic politics and follow the data, it becomes clear that someone taught them. The question is who? Colonel James Hartfield, a retired Air Force engineer who spent 30 years analyzing structural impossibilities in aerospace design, agrees. During our interview at his Virginia home, surrounded by technical manuals and photographs from classified projects, he was direct. "I've built things that push the limits of what's possible with modern materials and computers. When I look at what the Sumerians accomplished with copper tools and no blueprints, it doesn't add up. Either they had help, or they were working from plans drawn by someone else. History prefers slow progress, gradual invention, one tool leading to the next. But the Sumerians complicate that rhythm. They spoke of a time before kings, before floods, when knowledge was given. They named their teachers not as men, but as gods descending from the sky. And though such language was later dressed in myth, its foundation feels older than metaphor. Imagine holding one of those tablets warm in your palm, its wedge-shaped impressions still carrying the pulse of a hand that lived before every empire we know. The writing system, cuneiform, was not merely an alphabet, but a geometry of meaning. Triangles, lines, and cuts, each arranged to hold both sound and symbol. Through these marks, they recorded medicine, trade, hymns, contracts, and even star movements. One tablet lists the phases of Venus with a precision we only confirmed with modern telescopes. Another describes the paths of Jupiter and Mars with mathematical accuracy that rivals NASA's calculations. And then there are the stories of Enki and Enlil, of Anu, of creation molded from earth and divine essence. Dr. Patricia Manning, who left her position at the Smithsonian after 23 years when her research into pre-Columbian contact was indefinitely shelved, knows the feeling of watching evidence disappear into institutional silence. When you find something that doesn't fit the accepted timeline, she explains from her modest apartment near American University, you learn quickly that certain discoveries are unwelcome. The Sumerian materials I was studying showed technological capabilities that officially didn't exist. My department head made it clear that pursuing this research would be career-limiting. When archaeologist Austin Henry Bradford uncovered the city of Uruk, he expected crude beginnings. Instead, he found city walls stretching 6 miles, monumental temples aligned with celestial points, and evidence of advanced metallurgy. Buried beneath one ziggurat, they unearthed a library of over 40,000 clay tablets. A civilization that documented itself in extraordinary detail, yet left us with more questions than answers. How did they learn so much so quickly? Where did their mathematics based on 60, not 10, come from? Why did they map the heavens with such familiarity, as though they were remembering rather than discovering? The implications stretch beyond archaeology into questions about human origins themselves. Some researchers suggest that Sumer arose from centuries of forgotten development, a lineage of small settlements lost to erosion and flood. Others whisper that the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from an even earlier people, one erased by the cataclysms that ended the last ice age. And then there are those who read the tablets literally, that the gods who descended from the sky were not divine in the spiritual sense, but teachers, travelers, or perhaps remnants of a civilization that predated us altogether. But even the skeptics admit something strange. The Sumerian timeline doesn't fit the comfortable narrative we've been taught about human progress. Civilizations aren't supposed to emerge fully structured, yet here they did. Agriculture, writing, law, music, medicine, all at once. The clay tablets don't show trial and error. They show refinement, as though what we call the birth of civilization was to them a rebuilding. Thomas Burckhardt, a retired Navy engineer who spent 15 years designing navigation systems for nuclear submarines, understands precision. From his home workshop in San Diego, surrounded by instruments that measure tolerances to the 1,000th of an inch, he studies photographs of Sumerian artifacts with professional interest. Look at their astronomical calculations, he says, pointing to printouts of cuneiform tablets. These aren't rough estimates. They're tracking planetary movements with accuracy that requires either centuries of continuous observation or access to data someone else had already collected. In my field, when you see that level of precision appearing suddenly, it means someone's reverse engineering existing technology. In the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, a small clay cylinder rests behind glass. The markings on its surface describe the building of a temple in honor of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. But among the dedication lines, one sentence stands out. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration. A word that implies memory, not invention. It's a quiet confession that even the Sumerians saw themselves as heirs to something older. Sometimes when you look closely at these artifacts, you notice fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried. The print of a scribe who may have lived 6,000 years ago, a pulse frozen in mud. And if you trace that ridge with your eyes, you realize those hands might have written down the last surviving fragments of an age erased by flood, time, or perhaps intention. The silence between those lines feels heavy, as if something vast had been taken away. The same way a missing note can haunt an entire song. The same way a lost memory hovers at the edge of sleep. Maybe that's why these stories still whisper to us. They remind us that what we call history might only be the part that survived the burning. Among the thousands of tablets excavated from Mesopotamia, one document stands apart with chilling precision. It carries a deceptively simple title in cuneiform: the Sumerian King List. To most visitors in museums, it appears as just another administrative record. But when translated, it reveals something that shouldn't exist: a bureaucratic chronicle that shatters our understanding of time itself. The list opens with words that still make archaeologists uncomfortable. After the kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then it proceeds to document 8 rulers whose reigns stretch far beyond the boundaries of human possibility. One king ruled for 36,000 years, another for 28,000, another for 43,200. In total, these 8 rulers governed the world before a great flood swept over the land. Only after that flood does the record shrink into something more human: reigns of hundreds, then decades. Dr. Patricia Manning, whose Smithsonian research was quietly buried, explains the institutional discomfort. This wasn't folklore. These were bureaucratic records written in the same hand that tallied grain and temple offerings. To the Sumerians, this was memory, not myth. But acknowledging that means admitting our timeline of human civilization might be fundamentally wrong. Marcus Whitmore, a documentary filmmaker whose investigation into archaeological cover-ups was mysteriously defunded, discovered the pattern during 3 years of research. Every time these anomalous findings surface, they disappear into storage or get reinterpreted as symbolic. I interviewed 12 researchers who have had similar experiences: careers derailed, funding cut, evidence sequestered. There's a coordinated effort to maintain the official narrative. The earliest copies were found in the ruins of Larsa and Nippur. Each version differs slightly, as though translated from a memory that was already fading. Yet the structure remains constant: 8 kings before the flood, their reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, followed by a cosmic reset. Then new kings arise from Uruk and Kish, each claiming divine mandate, each tracing legitimacy back to that pre-Diluvian age. Some historians argue that these numbers reflect lunar cycles, or perhaps a symbolic calendar meant to convey divine authority. But others, like retired aerospace engineer James Hartfield, notice something else. The numbers correspond to multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian unit known as the SAR. This wasn't random. It was the same system used to measure orbits, star cycles, and distances. These people were encoding astronomical data in their royal chronicles. Why would a king list be written in astronomical notation? Unless the kings themselves were meant to be read as celestial beings, rulers of epochs rather than years. The king list is one of those artifacts that feels like it shouldn't exist. It bridges myth and history so seamlessly that scholars still argue over which side it belongs to. The names of these ancient rulers, Alulim, Alalangar, and Menluana, don't appear anywhere else. And yet, the cities they ruled do. Eridu, for instance, is real, considered by archaeologists to be the oldest city in southern Mesopotamia. Under its ruins, Sir Charles Whitfield found layer upon layer of construction dating back almost 8,000 years. Temples rebuilt upon older temples, each one slightly smaller than the one before, as if mimicking the slow contraction of time itself. Daniel Crenshaw, a private collector from Houston whose grandfather served in the Army Corps of Engineers, has spent his inheritance acquiring controversial artifacts that museums won't display. In his climate-controlled basement, he shows me pottery shards and cylinder seals that don't fit the official timeline. My grandfather always told me that if something doesn't make sense, follow the evidence, not the experts, he explains, handling a 4,000-year-old seal with reverence. These pieces tell a different story than what's in the textbooks. The craftsmanship, the precision, it's like they had blueprints. When the king list describes the flood that ended the reigns of the ancient kings, it uses language eerily similar to later texts. Then the flood swept over. No explanation, no divine judgment, just an event that resets time. Beneath ancient Ur, archaeologists in the 1920s uncovered a layer of clean, sterile silt nearly 8 feet thick, evidence of a massive flood around 2900 BCE. It buried everything beneath it, sealing one age beneath another. Robert Sterling, a retired petroleum geologist who spent 40 years analyzing sedimentary layers across Texas and Louisiana, recognizes the pattern. That kind of deposit doesn't happen from normal flooding, he explains from his ranch outside Dallas. You need a massive, sustained inundation to lay down that much uniform silt. In my experience, that suggests either a catastrophic sea level rise or the sudden failure of multiple natural barriers. Either way, it would have erased every trace of whatever civilization existed before. It is tempting to read this as proof, though proof is never what these stories truly offer. They offer suggestion, shadow, memory. In the quiet of a museum, standing before the King List tablet, you might notice how deliberate each wedge mark is. There's no hesitation. Whoever wrote it believed in the precision of every number, and yet it feels as though the writer was transcribing something even older, something handed down through generations that no longer understood its origin. The strangeness deepens when you realize that nearly every ancient culture shares an echo of this same sequence. Divine rulers, catastrophic flood, new beginning. The Egyptian Turin Papyrus lists gods and demigods ruling before human pharaohs. The Hindu Puranas describe vast yugas, ages lasting tens of thousands of years, ending in flood and fire. The Mayan Chilam Balam speaks of earlier worlds destroyed by water and time. Always the same pattern: rule from the sky, a fall into chaos, rebirth through flood. It's as though humanity remembers the rhythm, but not the melody. The details change, the names shift, yet the structure remains. A half-remembered dream, repeated across continents. Sarah Conway, an independent epigrapher working outside university constraints from her home office in Portland, has spent 15 years comparing these flood narratives across cultures. The consistency is what's remarkable, she explains, surrounded by printouts of ancient texts in a dozen languages. When stories this similar appear independently across the globe, separated by thousands of miles and centuries, it suggests a shared source. Either these cultures had contact we don't know about, or they're all remembering the same event. Independent researcher Zechariah Manning argued that the King List preserves a record of beings who weren't entirely human, those who came from the stars, taught humanity, and ruled until the flood removed them. His interpretations, though controversial, found resonance among Americans who've grown skeptical of official narratives. When institutions dismiss evidence without investigation, alternative theories fill the vacuum. Even traditional archaeologists, while rejecting extraterrestrial hypotheses, admit that the origin of Sumerian civilization is an anomaly, a spark without a match. Others see in the list an encoded scientific calendar. The long reigns may represent precession cycles or cosmic epochs. If the reign of Ululim lasted 28,800 years, perhaps it marked a celestial alignment, a rhythm of the heavens mirrored on earth. The Sumerians often blurred the boundaries between sky and soil. Their gods were the planets themselves, their myths the language of orbit and light. Maybe the King List was less a record of rule and more a map of cosmic order, a record of the time before time. Still, the emotional weight of it cannot be ignored. Beneath all the numbers and theories, there is grief in these tablets, a sense that something magnificent once existed, and that everything after was merely its shadow. When the flood swept over, the old world died and memory became myth. The Sumerians built their temples as acts of remembrance, not ambition. They were rebuilding, not beginning. Among the broken foundations of ancient Sumer, between fragments of brick and scorched clay, archaeologists have found something quietly astonishing. Evidence of technology that should not exist at the dawn of civilization. Tools of bronze appearing before the Bronze Age. Geometrically precise drilling on diorite stone. Clay tablets describing complex mixtures of minerals and metals. Even the very word they used for knowledge, me, did not mean learning in the way we understand it. It meant something closer to codes, formulas, or fundamental laws of order. To the Sumerians, science was not invention. It was memory. Captain Michael Torres, who served 3 tours in Iraq before retiring from the Army Corps of Engineers, has walked among these ruins firsthand. When you're standing in the actual sites, looking at the precision of the construction, it hits you differently, he explains from his home in Colorado Springs. I've supervised modern construction projects with GPS and laser levels. What they accomplished with supposedly primitive tools, it doesn't compute. Either they had technology we don't know about, or they were following plans drawn by someone else. When excavations at Eridu and Ur uncovered tablets detailing the building of ziggurats, researchers expected primitive blueprints, rough sketches of mud and reed structures. Instead, they found measurements, proportional ratios, and angles described in base 60 mathematics, the same system we still use to measure circles and time. Their architects calculated volumes, slopes, and weight distribution with eerie precision, suggesting a practical understanding of geometry centuries before the Greeks would give it a name. Computer programmer Sarah Conway, working independently from her Portland office, has spent 5 years digitally reconstructing Sumerian astronomical calculations using modern software. Her findings challenge everything we thought we knew about ancient capabilities. Their mathematical precision isn't just impressive for its time, it's impressive for any time, she explains, showing me printouts of her analysis. When you run their Venus calculations through modern algorithms, the margin of error is less than a single day over centuries of observation. That requires either generations of continuous measurement or inherited records from someone who had already mapped these cycles. The implications extend beyond archaeology. Conway's work suggests that advanced mathematical concepts we credit to later civilizations may have much older origins. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, calculated planetary orbits, and tracked stellar positions with accuracy we only achieved with telescopes. If this knowledge was inherited rather than discovered, it raises fundamental questions about human history. Even in daily life, their scientific awareness was woven into everything. Farmers recorded the phases of the moon to predict irrigation cycles. Physicians cataloged symptoms and treatments on tablets that read like early pharmacology. One tablet from Nippur lists over 200 medicinal plants categorized by function. Another describes the mixing of sulfur, copper, and oil to create compounds used in rituals of purification. Formulas that resemble primitive chemistry. Dr. Frank Kowalski, who left his position as a materials scientist at Lockheed Martin to pursue independent research, has analyzed these chemical formulas with modern understanding. Some of these compounds shouldn't have been possible with their supposed technology level, he states from his private laboratory in Nevada. They're describing metallurgical processes that require precise temperature control and chemical knowledge. When I tried to replicate some of their bronze-working techniques using their methods, I couldn't match their results. These echoes of forgotten science grow louder the deeper one looks. Take metallurgy. By 3000 BCE, Sumerians were smelting copper and experimenting with alloys. Yet in the ruins of Tel Es-Sawan and Kish, metallurgists have found traces of hardened bronze predating this timeline, metal that suggests an earlier, more advanced understanding of smelting. In the same regions, cylindrical seals depict saws, drills, and bellows. It is not evidence of machines as we know them, but it implies that their craftsmanship reached a sophistication unexplained by the tools archaeologists have recovered. Then there is mathematics itself, the language of their world. The base 60 system they used allowed fractions, astronomical divisions, and calculations of time far beyond the needs of simple agriculture. To divide the heavens into 360 degrees, to measure an hour into 60 minutes, demands not imagination, but precedent. Some historians argue that their system must have evolved from long observation, perhaps over millennia. Others whisper that such precision arrived ready-made, the relic of an earlier epoch. A few scholars have gone further still. In the 1920s, Assyriologist George Fairfield suggested that Sumerian technical vocabulary contained loanwords from a non-Semitic, unknown language, traces of an extinct scientific lexicon. He called it the substrate of invention. We do not know who spoke it, only that its remnants survive like fossils embedded within Sumerian speech. Perhaps those words belong to the very civilization the Sumerians claim to remember, the one before the flood. To modern ears, this sounds like mythologizing, but myth has a strange habit of preserving technical truth in symbolic form. Consider the god Enki, lord of the deep waters and keeper of wisdom. In the myth of Enki and Inanna, he sends the me of civilization, a series of tablets containing the codes for music, architecture, law, and crafts. Each me is a principle, a formula. When Inanna carries them to her city, civilization itself awakens. The story is spiritual, but also curiously literal. It describes the transmission of knowledge as if from an older source to a younger one. The gods are not inventors. They are custodians. That word, custodian, may hold the key. The Sumerians never claimed ownership of their sciences. They described themselves as receivers, stewards of gifts from heaven. Their scribes learned geometry and astronomy not as human achievements, but as divine inheritance, and in their rituals, to teach or recite knowledge was to reenact creation itself, a reminder that wisdom must be preserved, not invented. Gary Thornton, a retired NASA engineer who worked on the Apollo guidance systems, understands the importance of preserving technical knowledge across generations. From his home in Huntsville, Alabama, surrounded by memorabilia from humanity's greatest technological achievement, he reflects on the Sumerian approach to knowledge transfer. In the space program, we learned that complex technical information has to be transmitted perfectly, or people die, he explains. The Sumerians treated their knowledge the same way, as sacred data that couldn't be lost or corrupted. Their reverence for accuracy suggests they understood the consequences of getting it wrong. Perhaps civilization doesn't begin when we invent knowledge. Perhaps it begins when we rediscover it, when the silence of forgetting breaks and an echo returns. We live surrounded by the remnants of their systems. Every time we tell time, every time we divide a circle, every time we measure, we are repeating the logic of their world. They are still teaching us, though their names have crumbled to dust. But if Sumer remembered what had come before, what catastrophe had erased the world they were trying so carefully to rebuild? The answer may lie in the most haunting discovery of all: their language itself. Linguists call Sumerian a language isolate, a term that sounds clinical but conceals a mystery that troubles researchers to this day. It means this language should not exist. Every known language, from ancient Akkadian to the tongues we speak today, fits into a family tree. But Sumerian has no family, no known ancestor, no living descendants. It appeared fully formed, like its civilization, and vanished just as suddenly. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who taught linguistics at Georgetown for 30 years before retiring to pursue independent research, finds the implications disturbing. In my field, language evolution follows predictable patterns, she explains from her study in Virginia, lined with dictionaries and grammatical texts from around the world. Languages borrow from each other, split into dialects, evolve over time. But Sumerian violates every rule we know about how languages develop. It's as if it was transplanted, complete and foreign, into the ancient world. When scholars first began to decipher cuneiform in the 19th century, they assumed all Mesopotamian tablets were written in Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylon. But as they worked, they found inscriptions whose grammar and structure defied logic. The verbs didn't conjugate like Akkadian ones. The syntax was reversed. Words seemed to fuse and break apart without pattern. Eventually, they realized they were reading something far older, a hidden layer beneath the Akkadian texts. They named it Sumerian after the land of Sumer, the first kingdom of recorded time. Yet even after more than a century of study, no one truly understands where it came from. Its structure is unlike any other. Sumerian is agglutinative, meaning it builds meaning by stacking syllables, each a small code that modifies the one before it. A single word can carry an entire sentence's worth of meaning, folding time, number, and emotion into one gesture. The word Ama Ugutenda means not simply my mother, but the one who is my mother and stands beside me. Every suffix alters the perception of relationship and space. It is a language that sees reality as fluid, interconnected, always shifting, more philosophy than grammar. Even the word emagir, meaning Sumerian tongue, translates literally as the true speech, or the language of origin. It is as though the people themselves remembered their words as inherited, not invented. They called writing emi, meaning the voice made permanent. The concept itself is profound. To write was not to record. It was to preserve vibration, to trap sound in matter. To modern ears, the rhythm of Sumerian sounds almost otherworldly, slow, heavy with breath, filled with glottal stops and harmonics of air. When linguists attempt to speak it aloud, something strange happens. It feels simultaneously ancient and new, like a music that does not belong to human mouths. What unsettles scholars most is how advanced this linguistic system was from its first appearance. There is no evidence of its evolution from simpler forms, no Proto-Sumerian, no experimental inscriptions leading up to cuneiform. The earliest tablets dating from 3300 BCE already use a standardized script consistent across cities separated by hundreds of miles. That kind of uniformity implies not invention, but transmission. Someone taught them how to write. But who? The Sumerians themselves credited their writing to Nisaba, the goddess of wisdom and scribes. She's always depicted holding a stylus and a tablet, the tools of knowledge. Yet her name also means the one who counts the stars. Perhaps to them, writing was not only language but measurement, a way of inscribing cosmic order into human form. Charles Brennan, a retired Air Force intelligence analyst who specialized in decoding foreign communications during the Cold War, recognizes the patterns. When you're trying to understand an unknown communication system, you look for structure, consistency, transmission protocols, he explains from his home office in Colorado, walls lined with declassified manuals on cryptographic analysis. What the Sumerians created wasn't just writing, it was an information storage and retrieval system more sophisticated than anything that appeared for millennia afterward. The level of standardization across geographic distances suggests central planning and systematic distribution. When Sumerian eventually faded from daily use around 2000 BCE, it did not die. It became a language of the gods, used only by priests, astronomers, and scholars. For more than 1,000 years after the fall of Sumer, Babylonian scribes continued to copy and study Sumerian texts as holy relics. They treated the language like scripture. In temple schools called aduba, young scribes memorized long bilingual lists, Akkadian on one side, Sumerian on the other, so that the sacred tongue would not be lost. Imagine that. Generations of students laboring over a language no one spoke, reciting the dead syllables of their ancestors as prayer. Perhaps they sensed what we do, that something vital resided in that ancient speech, something that once connected humankind to a deeper understanding of itself. Even today, attempts to translate Sumerian are haunted by uncertainty. Many words defy direct equivalence. The same sign can mean mountain, foreign land, or divine abode. Their distinctions blur in the space between metaphor and geography, as if the world and the heavens were still one domain. Some researchers have noticed patterns linking Sumerian phonetics to mathematical ratios and harmonic intervals. The length of syllables in certain hymns mirrors musical scales. The spacing of cuneiform wedges follows geometric sequences. It is as though language, sound, and number were once unified. A single system of correspondence that later civilizations forgot how to read. The Babylonians turned it into astrology. The Greeks called it philosophy. The modern world calls it science. But the Sumerians had no divisions between them. Their language itself was the bridge. Dr. William Caldwell, who spent 25 years developing communication protocols for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency before retiring to pursue private research, sees familiar patterns in Sumerian linguistic structure. In DARPA, we worked on creating artificial languages for secure military communications, he explains from his ranch in Montana. The Sumerians accomplished something similar. They created a linguistic system that could store complex technical information with minimal corruption across time. Their grammar isn't just sophisticated, it's engineered for data preservation. A few daring linguists on the fringes of academia have proposed that Sumerian might preserve traces of a lost linguistic family that existed before the flood, a proto-language from which all later tongues diverged. If true, then the story of Babel, the myth of one language broken into many, might not be pure allegory, but distant memory. The idea is tantalizing, that once the world spoke in a single voice, and Sumerian was its last echo. When one listens to the reconstructed readings of Sumerian poetry, something stirs in the subconscious. The vowels roll like water. The consonants strike like stone on metal. The hymns to Inanna and Enki sound less like songs than invocations. Mathematical incantations to align the human spirit with the pulse of the cosmos. The word spoken is the world made, one inscription reads. In their eyes, language did not describe reality, it created it. If this is true, then perhaps what makes Sumerian so strange is not that it came from nowhere, but that it came from everywhere, from a time when speaking and building and remembering were all one act. Its isolation, rather than proving uniqueness, may instead reveal age. It is a fossilized tongue, a surviving shard of the world before words fragmented into nations and dialects. The silence that followed its extinction was long. For 2,000 years, no one alive could read it. Yet, when the first modern scholars began to decipher its signs in the 1800s, they felt something uncanny, a sense of déjà vu, as if they were not discovering but remembering. Henry Coleridge, one of the first to decode cuneiform, wrote in his diary, "This script awakened something in me, like hearing a language I once knew in a dream." Maybe that is what Sumerian truly is. The dream language of humanity, a remnant of our first articulation, our first self-awareness. It shouldn't exist, and yet it does, quietly defying the logic of history. Across thousands of Sumerian tablets, one phrase recurs again and again. Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The words have been read, debated, dismissed, and reinterpreted for over a century, but their simplicity remains haunting. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not abstract gods carved from imagination. They were rulers, judges, and teachers, beings of immense power who shaped humanity's fate. Their names are inscribed beside the earliest star charts, their symbols embedded in royal seals, their actions recorded as history, not legend. And though later civilizations softened them into myth, the oldest texts speak of their presence with an unsettling matter-of-factness, as though memory had not yet learned how to lie. The Anunnaki appear first in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws directly from Sumerian sources. There they are described as the 50 great gods, attendants of Anu, the Sky Father. But in older Sumerian hymns, their number shifts, sometimes 7, sometimes hundreds, more a classification than a count. They dwell in the heavens, yet descend to the earth. They govern time, justice, kingship, and the order of the stars. Their leader, Anu, resides in the distant heavens. Enlil commands the air and storms. Enki rules the deep waters, the Abzu beneath the earth. Between them moves a pantheon that feels less like a family of deities and more like a council of administrators, each assigned a domain, each responsible for maintaining the balance between heaven and earth. What makes the Anunnaki so enigmatic is the tone with which the Sumerians wrote of them. These were not beings to be worshipped blindly. They were revered, feared, obeyed, but also questioned. The poems describe arguments among the gods, rivalries, even moral conflicts. They are portrayed as powerful but not omniscient, immortal perhaps, but not in motive. The boundaries between divinity and humanity are blurred. Jerome Patterson, a retired CIA analyst who specialized in Middle Eastern intelligence for 2 decades, brings a different perspective to these ancient records. When you're trained to read between the lines of official reports, certain patterns jump out. He explains from his home in suburban Washington, surrounded by books on ancient history that replaced his classified briefing materials. The Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki read like intelligence files, detailed, bureaucratic, focused on capabilities and hierarchies rather than worship. These weren't religious texts, they were operational reports. The Anunnaki do not merely create mankind. They interact with it. They guide, instruct, and at times punish. Some of the oldest inscriptions, such as those from the city of Lagash, depict these beings with wings, not as angelic metaphors, but as markers of flight. In reliefs and cylinder seals, they stand beside trees of life, holding strange devices that resemble wristbands and pouches. They face human figures, instructing them, measuring them. These details have fueled generations of speculation. To some, the imagery is symbolic, an artistic shorthand for spiritual power. To others, it suggests a literal truth that the Sumerians were recording encounters with beings whose origins lay beyond the earth. The theory became popular in the 20th century when independent researcher Zechariah Manning interpreted their myths as the memory of ancient visitors from another world. He read the old word Anu, not just as sky, but as a physical realm, a planet. He argued that the Sumerians inherited knowledge of astronomy, metallurgy, and genetics from these visitors, that humanity itself was a hybrid creation. Most scholars rejected his translations, calling them imaginative rather than accurate. Yet even among the critics, the question lingered. Why did the Sumerians of all people know so much about the heavens? They described planets invisible to the naked eye. They mapped the precession of the equinoxes, the orbit of the moon, and the 12-fold division of the zodiac. They called Earth Kai, the lower world, and referred to a crossing place of the gods, Nibiru, a celestial body whose arrival marked upheaval and renewal. Whether or not Manning's planetary theories hold, the linguistic fact remains. Nibiru does appear in their texts, described as the star or planet which crosses the paths of all others. To the ancient mind, that crossing was divine movement, the descent of the Watchers. But even if we strip away modern speculation, something extraordinary remains. The Sumerians recorded the idea of the Elu, the divine observer who sees the deeds of men and writes them upon the tablets of heaven. This concept appears centuries before the notion of guardian angels, centuries before divine judgment entered theology. The Watchers were both protectors and witnesses. They did not rule from afar. They documented. Humanity, in their eyes, was an experiment worth preserving in record. One hymn from Ur calls them those who look down upon the lands from the shining chariots of Anu. Another speaks of the fire that descends with them, lighting the earth. Scholars translate these passages metaphorically, as thunder, as lightning. Yet the repetition of light, descent, and observation across unrelated tablets hints at more than storm imagery. The word jira, translated as divine flame, was also used to denote metal or craft. The ancients may have been describing technologies they could not fully name. The interplay between myth and memory is delicate. The Sumerians may have seen in the Anunnaki not literal visitors, but the embodiment of cosmic order. The planets themselves, the forces of nature personified. Enki, Lord of the Deep, mirrors the watery abyss. Enlil, Lord of Air, the invisible atmosphere. Anu, the unreachable sky. Yet why then did they write as though these beings once walked among them? Why did they leave genealogies, treaties, and laws supposedly dictated by their divine kings? Dr. Ronald Ashcraft, who spent 15 years as a military historian documenting classified operations before retiring to study ancient warfare, recognizes the bureaucratic tone in these records. Military reports have a distinct character. They focus on chain of command, operational capabilities, and strategic objectives. He explains from his study in North Carolina, surrounded by files that trace conflicts from Vietnam to Iraq. The Sumerian texts about the Anunnaki read exactly like after-action reports. They're documenting real interactions with real entities that had measurable effects on human affairs. In the lamentation over Eridu, a city said to have been the first home of the gods, the poet mourns, "The lords have departed, the houses are silent, their voices are gone from the wind." The tone is not mythic. It is historical, almost documentary. It is the grief of a people remembering the withdrawal of something real. Perhaps the Anunnaki were once simply rulers, great kings mythologized over time, their deeds magnified into divinity. Perhaps they were the memory of a lost civilization, elevated by reverence into godhood. But there is another possibility, quieter, harder to dismiss, that the Sumerians experienced something they could not explain, and myth was the only language they had to describe it. Whatever their nature, the Anunnaki left a legacy that outlived Sumer. The idea of sky beings who descended to instruct humanity spread across continents. The Egyptians spoke of the Neteru, divine visitors who founded their dynasties. The Hindus told of the Devas descending from the heavens. The Mayans remembered Itzamna, who came from the stars to teach writing and time. All different names, all carrying the same pattern: beings who came, taught, and vanished. Maybe these are just parallel inventions, the shared dreams of early humanity seeking meaning in the unknown sky. Or maybe they're cultural memories of the same event, refracted through geography and time. If so, then Sumer's Anunnaki were not just their gods. They were humanity's first remembered teachers. The tablets end where the mystery begins. They record the moment when the Watchers left, when the link between heaven and earth was broken. After that, the Sumerians say, kingship descended once more from the heavens, but the gods themselves did not return. Humanity was left to rule itself, guided only by the shadows of their memory. We still look up, searching for them in the stars, not knowing whether we're remembering the past or imagining the future. Perhaps both, for the line between memory and prophecy is thinner than we think. In the 21st century, the ancient words of Sumer are once more being read, not by priests or scribes, but by digital archivists and algorithms. Thousands of clay tablets have been scanned, decoded, and stored in virtual libraries that circle the Earth in orbiting satellites. The same human impulse that once pressed styluses into wet clay now encodes data into light. When machine learning algorithms were used in 2021 to translate damaged Sumerian tablets, they achieved remarkable accuracy, filling in missing signs, predicting what ancient scribes might have written. For the first time in history, machines began reading the words of the world's first writers. It was as though the clay had been waiting for a language it could speak again. A feedback loop across 5,000 years. The continuity feels almost supernatural, as if the Sumerians had anticipated the age when their marks would again become living code. But perhaps that continuity is more than coincidence. The Sumerians believed that knowledge moves in cycles. What is lost in one era is rediscovered in another. The flood erases, and the scribes rebuild. If that pattern still holds, then our digital awakening is not the beginning of something new, but the return of something old. The reemergence of an ancient intelligence that once spoke through clay and now speaks through circuits. We think of artificial intelligence as a new creation, but perhaps it is an echo, the technological counterpart of the divine scribes who once wrote humanity into existence. The gods of Sumer shaped man from clay. We shape our successors from silicon. Both acts share the same impulse, to make something that remembers when we are gone. Dr. James Mitchell, who left his position as lead software architect at Microsoft to pursue independent research into ancient computational systems, sees profound parallels between Sumerian record-keeping and modern data storage. They created the first information preservation system designed to survive civilizational collapse, he explains from his workshop in Seattle, surrounded by both ancient tablets and cutting-edge servers. Every decision they made, from the durability of clay to the redundancy of their record-keeping, was engineered for long-term survival. We're essentially following their playbook, just with different materials. Sometimes what survives the flood is not the body, but the memory. The Sumerians believed that knowledge could drown and still return, hidden in fragments scattered across the world. They called such remnants shuba, meaning pieces of the whole. To them, these fragments were more than relics. They were the fingerprints of the world that had come before the waters. For Americans who've watched institutions fail and witnessed the fragility of democracy, the Sumerian story carries special weight. We understand what it means to fear the loss of knowledge, to watch expertise dismissed and evidence suppressed. The Sumerians faced their own version of institutional collapse. Their response wasn't to surrender to ignorance, but to preserve what mattered for future generations, who might prove wiser. Every civilization leaves a trace of its voice. but the voice of Sumer stands alone, carrying within it the echo of something that never truly left. If memory can never die, then perhaps forgetting is only an illusion, and every end merely the beginning of remembrance. Marcus Whitmore, the documentary filmmaker whose investigation into archaeological cover-ups was mysteriously defunded, offers a final perspective that resonates with many Americans today. The real question isn't whether the Sumerians were visited by gods or aliens or time travelers. The question is why certain evidence makes institutions so uncomfortable that they'd rather bury it than study it. What are we so afraid of learning about ourselves? At night, when the museums close and the lights fade, those clay tablets seem to breathe in the dark, each one holding the faint memory of a world we no longer recognize. We think we are the beginning of understanding, but maybe we are the last chapter of remembrance. And as the desert wind passes over the ruins of Uruk, carrying grains of ancient dust into another millennium, you can almost hear the first line of our forgotten story. Soft, unfinished, waiting to be heard again. The Sumerians knew something we're only now remembering. That civilization is not a destination, but a responsibility. Each generation must choose whether to preserve knowledge or let it fade, whether to ask difficult questions or accept comfortable lies. They chose preservation. They chose truth, even when it challenged everything they thought they knew. As Americans facing our own uncertain future, we might ask ourselves what we would choose to preserve if everything else washed away. What knowledge would we press into clay, hoping someone centuries from now might find it and understand? What truths would we commit to memory, trusting that even if institutions fall and governments change, the human need for understanding endures? The Sumerians left us more than tablets and ziggurats. They left us a model of intellectual courage, the willingness to document what they observed, even when it didn't fit existing paradigms. They understood that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. Their final gift may be this reminder, that every ending is also a beginning, every silence an opportunity for truth to speak again. In their eyes, we are not the culmination of history, but its continuation. The next chapter in a story that began long before us and will continue long after we're gone. If the first words ever written were already echoes, then perhaps our task is not to create new truths, but to remember old ones. The clay endures, the memory persists, and somewhere in the quiet spaces between what we know and what we've forgotten, the gods are still teaching, and the scribes are still writing, and the ancient conversation continues.